Vladimir Lenin. The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Bourgeois and Proletarian Democracy. The question which Kautsky has so shamelessly muddled really stands as follows. If we are not to mock at common sense and history, it is obvious that we cannot speak of pure democracy as long as different classes exist, we can only speak of class democracy. Let us say in parenthesis that pure democracy is not only an ignorant phrase, revealing a lack of understanding both of the class struggle and of the nature of the state, but also a thrice empty phrase, since in communist society democracy will wither away in the process of changing and becoming a habit, but will never be pure democracy. Pure democracy is the mendacious phrase of a liberal who wants to fool the workers. History knows of bourgeois democracy which takes the place of feudalism, and of proletarian democracy which takes the place of bourgeois democracy. When Kautsky devotes dozens of pages to proving the truth bourgeois democracy is progressive compared with medievalism, and that the proletariat must unfailingly utilize it in its struggle against the bourgeoisie, that in fact is just liberal twaddle intended to fool the workers. This is a truism, not only for educated Germany, but also for uneducated Russia. Kautsky is simply throwing learned dust in the eyes of the workers when, with a pompous mien, he talks about Weitling and the Jesuits of Paraguay and many other things, in order to avoid telling about the bourgeois essence of modern, i.e., capitalist, democracy. Kautsky takes from Marxism what is acceptable to the liberals, to the bourgeoisie, the criticism of the Middle Ages, and the progressive historical role of capitalism in general and of capitalist democracy in particular, and discards, passes over in silence, glosses over all that in Marxism which is unacceptable to the bourgeoisie, the revolutionary violence of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie for the latter's destruction. Is why Kautsky, by virtue of his objective position and irrespective of what his subjective convictions may be, inevitably proves to be a lackey of the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois democracy, although a great historical advance in comparison with medievalism, always remains, and under capitalism is bound to remain, restricted, truncated, false and hypocritical, a paradise for the rich and a snare and deception for the exploited, for the poor. It is this truth, which forms a most essential part of Marx's teaching, that Kautsky the Marxist has failed to understand. On this, the fundamental issue Kautsky offers delights for the bourgeoisie instead of a scientific criticism of those conditions which make every bourgeois democracy a democracy for the rich. Let us first remind the most learned Mr. Kautsky of the theoretical propositions of Marx and Engels which that pedant has so disgracefully forgotten, to please the bourgeoisie, and then explain the matter as popularly as possible. Not only the ancient and feudal, but also the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. Engels, in his work on the state, see footnote 8 as, therefore, the state is only a transitional institution which is used in the struggle, in the revolution, to hold down one's adversaries by force. It is sheer nonsense to talk of a free people's state, so long as the proletariat still needs the state, it does not need it in the interests of freedom but in order to hold down its adversaries, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom the state as such ceases to exist. Engels, in his letter to Babel, March 28, 1875. In reality, however, the state is nothing but a machine for the oppression of one class by another, and indeed in the democratic republic no less than in the monarchy. Engels, Introduction to the Civil War in France by Marx. See footnote 9. Universal suffrage is the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present-day state. Engels, in his work on the state see footnote 10. Mr. Kautsky very tediously chews over the cut in the first part of this proposition, which is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. But the second part, which we have italicized and which is not acceptable to the bourgeoisie, the renegade Kautsky passes over in silence. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary, body, executive and legislative at the same time. Instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to represent and suppress, verunzertreten, the people in parliament, Universal suffrage was to serve the people, constituted in communes, as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for workers, foremen and accountants for his business. Marx, in his work on the Paris Commune, the Civil War in France. See footnote 11. Every one of these propositions, which are excellently known to the most learned Mr. Kautsky, is a slap in his face and lays bare his apostasy. Nowhere in his pamphlet does Kautsky reveal the slightest understanding of these truths. His whole pamphlet is a sheer mockery of Marxism. Take the fundamental laws of modern states, take their administration, take freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, or equality of all citizens before the law, and you will see at every turn evidence of the hypocrisy of bourgeois democracy with which every honest and class-conscious worker is familiar. There is not a single state, however democratic, which has no loopholes or reservations in its constitution guaranteeing the bourgeoisie the possibility of dispatching troops against the workers, of proclaiming martial law, and so forth, in case of a violation of public order, and actually in case the exploited class violates its position of slavery and tries to behave in a non-slavish manner. Kautsky shamelessly embellishes bourgeois democracy and omits to mention, for instance, how the most democratic and republican bourgeoisie in America or Switzerland deal with workers on strike. The wise and learned Kautsky keeps silent about these things. That learned politician does not realize that to remain silent on this matter is despicable. He prefers to tell the workers nursery tales of the kind that democracy means protecting the minority. It is incredible, but it is a fact. In the year of our Lord 1918, in the 5th year of the world imperialist slaughter and the strangulation of internationalist minorities, i.e., those who have not despicably betrayed socialism, like the Renaudels and Longwets, the Shademans and Kautskys, the Hendersons and Webbs et Alabama, in all democracies of the world, the learned Mr. Kautsky sweetly, very sweetly, sings the praises of protection of the minority. Those who are interested may read this on page 15 of Kautsky's pamphlet. And on page 16 this learned individual tells you about the Whigs and Tories in England in the 18th century. What wonderful erudition! What refined servility to the bourgeoisie! What civilized belly-crawling before the capitalists and boot-licking! If I were Crook or Shademan, or Clemenceau or Renaudel, I would pay Mr. Kautsky millions, reward him with Judas kisses, praise him before the workers and urge socialist unity with honorable men like him. To write pamphlets against the dictatorship of the proletariat, to talk about the Whigs and Tories in England in the 18th century, to assert that democracy means protecting the minority, and remain silent about pogroms against internationalists in the Democratic Republic of America isn't this rendering lackey service to the bourgeoisie? The learned Mr. Kautsky has accidentally forgotten, probably a trifle, namely, that the ruling party in a bourgeois democracy extends the protection of the minority only to another bourgeois party, while the proletariat, on all serious, profound and fundamental issues, gets martial law or pogroms, instead of the protection of the minority. The more highly developed a democracy is, the more imminent are pogroms or civil war in connection with any profound political divergence which is dangerous to the bourgeoisie. The learned Mr. Kautsky could have studied this law of bourgeois democracy in connection with the Dreyfus case, see footnote 12, in Republican France, with the lynching of Negroes and internationalists in the Democratic Republic of America, with the case of Ireland and Ulster in Democratic Britain, see footnote 13, with the baiting of the Bolsheviks and the staging of pogroms against them in April 1917 in the Democratic Republic of Russia. I have purposely chosen examples not only from wartime but also from pre-wartime, peacetime. But mealy-mouthed Mr. Kautsky prefers to shut his eyes to these facts of the 20th century, and instead to tell the workers wonderfully new, remarkably interesting, unusually edifying and incredibly important things about the Whigs and Tories of the 18th century. Take the bourgeois parliament. Can it be that the learned Kautsky has never heard that the more highly democracy is developed, the more the bourgeois parliaments are subjected by the stock exchange and the bankers? This does not mean that we must not make use of bourgeois parliament. The Bolsheviks made better use of it than probably any other party in the world, for in 1912-15 we won the entire workers' curia in the Fourth Duma. But it does mean that only a liberal can forget the historical limitations and conventional nature of the bourgeois parliamentary system as Kautsky does. Even in the most democratic bourgeois state, the oppressed people at every step encounter the crying contradiction between the formal equality proclaimed by the democracy of the capitalists and the thousands of real limitations and subterfuges which turn the proletarians into wage slaves. It is precisely this contradiction that is opening the eyes of the people to the rottenness, mendacity and hypocrisy of capitalism. It is this contradiction that the agitators and propagandists of socialism are constantly exposing to the people, in order to prepare them for revolution. And now that the era of revolution has begun, Kautsky turns his back upon it and begins to extol the charms of moribund bourgeois democracy. Proletarian democracy, of which Soviet government is one of the forms, has brought a development and expansion of democracy unprecedented in the world, for the vast majority of the population, for the exploited and working people. To write a whole pamphlet about democracy, as Kautsky did, in which 2 pages are devoted to dictatorship and dozens to pure democracy, and fail to notice this fact, means completely distorting the subject in liberal fashion. Take foreign policy. In no bourgeois state, not even in the most democratic, is it conducted openly. The people are deceived everywhere, and in democratic France, Switzerland, America and Britain this is done on an incomparably wider scale and in an incomparably subtler manner than in other countries. The Soviet government has torn the veil of mystery from foreign policy in a revolutionary manner. Kautsky has not noticed this, he keeps silent about it, although in the era of predatory wars and secret treaties for the division of spheres of influence, i.e., for the partition of the world among the capitalist bandits, this is of cardinal importance, for on it depends the question of peace, the life and death of tens of millions of people. Take the structure of the state. Kautsky picks at all manner of trifles, down to the argument that under the Soviet constitution elections are indirect, but he misses the point. He fails to see the class nature of the state apparatus, of the machinery of state. Under bourgeois democracy the capitalists, by thousands of tricks which are the more artful and effective the more pure democracy is developed, drive the people away from administrative work, from freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, etc. The Soviet government is the first in the world, or strictly speaking, the second, because the Paris Commune began to do the same thing, to enlist the people, specifically the exploited people, in the work of administration. The working people are barred from participation in bourgeois parliaments, they never decide important questions under bourgeois democracy, which are decided by the stock exchange and the banks, by thousands of obstacles, and the workers know and feel, see and realize perfectly well that the bourgeois parliaments are institutions alien to them, instruments for the oppression of the workers by the bourgeoisie, institutions of a hostile class, of the exploiting minority. The Soviets are the direct organization of the working and exploited people themselves, which helps them to organize and administer their own state in every possible way. And in this it is the vanguard of the working and exploited people, the urban proletariat, that enjoys the advantage of being best united by the large enterprises. It is easier for it than for all others to elect and exercise control over those elected. The Soviet form of organization automatically helps to unite all the working and exploited people around their vanguard, the proletariat. The old bourgeois apparatus, the bureaucracy, the privileges of wealth, of bourgeois education, of social connections, etc., these real privileges are the more varied the more highly bourgeois democracy is developed. All this disappears under the Soviet form of organization. Freedom of the press ceases to be hypocrisy, because the printing plants and stocks of paper are taken away from the bourgeoisie. The same thing applies to the best buildings, the palaces, the mansions and manor houses. Soviet power took thousands upon thousands of these best buildings from the exploiters at one stroke, and in this way made the right of assembly, without which democracy is a fraud, 1,000,000 times more democratic for the people. Indirect elections to non-local Soviets make it easier to hold congresses of Soviets. They make the entire apparatus less costly, more flexible, more accessible to the workers and peasants at a time when life is seething and it is necessary to be able very quickly to recall one's local deputy or to delegate him to a general congress of Soviets. Proletarian democracy is a million times more democratic than any bourgeois democracy. Soviet power is a million times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. To fail to see this, one must either deliberately serve the bourgeoisie, or be politically as dead as a doornail, unable to see real life from behind the dusty pages of bourgeois books, be thoroughly imbued with bourgeois democratic prejudices, and thereby objectively convert oneself into a lackey of the bourgeoisie. To fail to see this, one must be incapable of presenting the question from the point of view of the oppressed classes. Is there a single country in the world, even among the most democratic bourgeois countries, in which the average rank and file worker, the average rank and file farm laborer, or village semi-proletarian generally, i.e., the representative of the oppressed, of the overwhelming majority of the population, enjoys anything approaching such liberty of holding meetings in the best buildings, such liberty of using the largest printing plants and biggest stocks of paper to express his ideas and to defend his interests, such liberty of promoting men and women of his own class to administer and to knock into shape the state, as in Soviet Russia? It is ridiculous to think that Mr. Kautsky could find in any country even 1 out of 1,000 of well-informed workers or farm laborers who would have any doubts as to the reply. Instinctively, from hearing fragments of admissions of the truth in the bourgeois press, the workers of the whole world sympathize with the Soviet Republic precisely because they regard it as a proletarian democracy, a democracy for the poor, and not a democracy for the rich that every bourgeois democracy, even the best, actually is. We are governed, and our state is knocked into shape, by bourgeois bureaucrats, by bourgeois members of parliament, by bourgeois judges. Such is the simple, obvious and indisputable truth which tens and hundreds of millions of people belonging to the oppressed classes in all bourgeois countries, including the most democratic, know from their own experience, feel and realize every day. In Russia, however, the bureaucratic machine has been completely smashed, razed to the ground, the old judges have all been sent packing, the bourgeois parliament has been dispersed and far more accessible representation has been given to the workers and peasants. Their Soviets have replaced the bureaucrats, or their Soviets have been put in control of the bureaucrats, and their Soviets have been authorized to elect the judges. This fact alone is enough for all the oppressed classes to recognize that Soviet power, i.e., the present form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is a million times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. Kautsky does not understand this truth, which is so clear and obvious to every worker, because he has forgotten, unlearned, to put the question, democracy for which class? He argues from the point of view of pure, i.e., non-class or above class, democracy. He argues like Shylock, my pound of flesh and nothing else. Equality for all citizens, otherwise there is no democracy. We must ask the learned Kautsky, the Marxist and socialist Kautsky. Can there be equality between the exploited and the exploiters? It is dreadful, it is incredible that such a question should have to be put in discussing a book written by the ideological leader of the Second International. But having put your hand to the plow, don't look back, and having undertaken to write about Kautsky, I must explain to the learned man why there can be no equality between the exploiter and the exploited. Endnotes. 8. Frederick Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, Moscow, 1962, Volume 2, p. 320. 9. Karl Marx, The Civil War in France, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, Moscow, 1962, Volume I, p. 585. p. 253. 10. Frederick Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Marx and Engels, Selected Works, Moscow, 1962, Volume 2, p. 332. 11. Marx and Engels, Selected Works, Moscow, 1962, Volume I, pages 520 to 21. 12 In 1895, reactionary monarchist circles in France instituted proceedings against Dreyfus, a Jewish general staff officer, on a trumped-up charge of espionage and high treason. The trial of Dreyfus, who was sentenced to life imprisonment, served as a pretext for French reactionary circles to fan anti-Semitism and campaign against republican order and democratic liberties. In 1898, socialists and progressive bourgeois Democrats, Émile Zola, Jean Jaurès, Anatole France and others, started a campaign for a reconsideration of the Dreyfus case. This gave a political coloring to the matter, and the country split into two camps: Republicans and Democrats on the one side and the bloc of monarchists, clericals, anti-Semites and nationalists on the other. In 1899, under pressure of public opinion, Dreyfus was pardoned, and in 1906 the Court of Appeal acquitted him and reinstated him in the army. 13 This refers to the suppression of the Irish Rebellion in 1910, an attempt at liberating the country from the British. In 1916 Lenin wrote, "In Europe, there was a rebellion in Ireland, which the freedom-loving English suppressed by executions." Collected Works, Volume 22, p. 355.